The march of the Sixth Army, Hitler aims for the Volga. In the sweltering summer heat of July 1942, the fate of World War II was beginning to unfold across a vast, frozen and cruel territory in the heart of the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler, the obstinate leader of the Third Reich, cast his cold, unwavering gaze upon a city that symbolized Soviet power, Stalingrad. It was more than just a strategic target. Stalingrad bore the name of Joseph Stalin, the USSR's supreme commander, and taking the city would be a devastating moral blow, a humiliation Hitler wanted to inflict at any cost. He then ordered the powerful Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, to march through southern Russia with a clear and relentless mission to conquer Stalingrad, open the way to the oil fields of the Caucasus, and crush the Soviet spirit. The Sixth Army was no ordinary group. It was a veritable war machine. Tens of thousands of soldiers, gleaming tanks, heavy artillery, and planes roaring overhead. They marched along dusty dirt roads under a scorching sun that seemed intent on testing the endurance of every man and machine. Weary but determined, men advanced in single file, their eyes fixed on the horizon, knowing that the path ahead would not be a simple conquest. It would be a brutal, bloody battle where every inch of land would be fought for in blood. The Sixth Army's march seemed unstoppable. Tiger and Panzer tanks cut across the Russian plain like predators, spewing smoke and destruction. The ground trembled under the weight of heavy artillery, while Luftwaffe planes bombed villages and enemy positions, clearing the way for the ground troops. But no one on that march could yet imagine the hell that awaited them. The ruined streets, the constant crossfire, the winter that would freeze not only bodies but also hopes. Hitler was certain that taking Stalingrad would mean the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union in that war. But what he didn't know was that the Soviets were ready to resist with desperate fury, willing to fight to the last drop of blood, and that the Sixth Army would soon find itself trapped in a nightmare of fire, ice, and death in the heart of a white hell. As the Sixth Army advanced relentlessly towards Stalingrad, in the highest echelons of the German command, the plan that underpinned this entire operation took shape and ambition. Hitler's strategy was not just to take the city, but to deliver a blow so powerful that it would crush the heart of Soviet resistance. The objective was clear and cruel: to cut off vital supplies via the Volga River, the great artery that guaranteed the flow of men, weapons and supplies to the Soviet defenders. Without this route, Stalingrad would become a fiery prison for its inhabitants and soldiers. Furthermore, taking the city would open the way to the vast oil fields in the Caucasus, a vital strategic prize for fueling the German war machines. The plan was a brutal game of military chess. The Sixth Army would attack Stalingrad directly, drawing all the enemy's attention and strength into the fighting in the destroyed streets. At the same time, other German units and their allies would advance from the flanks to encircle and isolate the city, blocking any attempt at reinforcement or escape. It was an ironclad siege in the making, a trap designed to annihilate any remaining Soviet resistance. Confidence was enormous. The German generals believed that the Nazi war machine, with its technical prowess and fierce discipline, would crush any resistance, especially in a city that until then had seemed like just a dot on the vast Soviet map. But what they didn't anticipate was the desperate determination of the Russian defenders, the harsh terrain, and the brutal weather that would begin to work against them. So, with the blazing July sun beating down on their backs and artillery rumbling in the distance, the Sixth Army advanced, ignoring the warning signs that they were entering a battle unlike any other, a fight that would be dirty, bloody, and filled with unimaginable sacrifices. The stage was set. The heart of the Soviet Union would bleed, and the entire world would witness the most ferocious and cruel confrontation World War II had ever seen. Want to understand the battles that changed the world? Sign up and join us on this epic journey through World War II. With the plan set, and the Sixth Army already approaching, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, received orders to prepare the ground with a storm of fire and destruction. It was late August 1942, and the sky over Stalingrad darkened with hundreds of bombers and fighters roaring overhead, ready to open a bloody path for the ground troops. The bombardment began with a hellish thunderclap. For hours, Stalingrad was reduced to a sea of flames and smoke. Buildings were reduced to mountains of rubble. Streets disappeared beneath the ruins, and the air became heavy with the smell of gunpowder, death, and fire. Homes that had once sheltered families were now makeshift fortresses, or simply hiding places where death lurked around every corner. This attack wasn't just a way to clear the way. It was a punishment, a brutal warning that the invaders would accept no resistance. But contrary to what the Germans expected, the flames didn't destroy the spirit of the Soviet defenders. On the contrary, they heartened them. The remaining Soviet soldiers and civilians became shadows among the rubble, transforming every ruin into a trench, every basement into a battlefield. The urban inferno unfolding there was unprecedented. The fire seemed to consume everything, but the fighting was only just beginning. The Germans were advancing on a city that no longer existed as such, just a labyrinth of death, where the enemy could be behind any destroyed wall, in any dark corner. The smell of smoke and blood filled the air, and with each step forward, the soldiers knew they were entering a scenario where survival would be as fierce a battle as conquest. Stalingrad was about to become the largest urban battlefield in history, where the heat of fire would mingle with the deadly cold of the approaching winter. When the first German soldiers stepped onto the destroyed streets of Stalingrad, they realized immediately that the battle would be very different from any they had faced before. This was no longer a war of vast open fields or clear front lines. This was brutal, suffocating, house by house, stone by stone. Every ruined building became a fortress. Every broken window, every dark basement hid Soviet soldiers armed to the teeth, ready to attack or ambush without warning. There was no room for traditional tank or infantry formations. It was a veritable urban hell where the enemy could be just meters away, ready to open fire or throw a grenade. The fighting was fierce and bloody, the streets filled with shouts, gunfire, explosions, and the suffocating smell of gunpowder. Soldiers faced each other in hand-to-hand duels, using bayonets, pistols, and even their bare hands when ammunition ran out. There was no room for hesitation. The slightest mistake meant instant death. The Germans advanced slowly, often losing ground soon after gaining it, as the Soviets counterattacked with almost supernatural tenacity. The ground was strewn with bodies, blood mingling with the dust and ash of destroyed buildings. The entire city seemed like a vast human minefield where every corner hid a new threat. For the soldiers of the Sixth Army, reality was grim. Stalingrad would not be a quick and clean victory, but a bloody and prolonged nightmare. What seemed like a victorious march turned into a desperate battle for survival. A struggle where courage, endurance, and brutality were the only weapons capable of keeping anyone alive. Here, you'll experience the history of the war in unprecedented detail. Subscribe and don't miss a single chapter of this saga. Not one step back. Stalin's Order, 227. As the streets of Stalingrad became a veritable hell of fire, blood, and steel, a ruthless order echoed from the heart of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, faced with the threat of losing the city that bore his name, decreed a drastic and brutal measure, Order 227, known as Not One Step Back. This order meant there would be no retreat under any circumstances. No Soviet soldier could turn around or abandon his position, even if it meant facing certain death. Anyone who disobeyed would be subject to severe punishment, including summary execution. Stalin wanted to show that the defense of Stalingrad would be relentless and that the city would not be surrendered to the Germans without a fight to the finish. The impact of this order was felt in every trench, in every destroyed street. Soviet soldiers, exhausted and starving, found in the determination imposed by Stalin an almost supernatural strength. They fought not only for their lives, but for the honor of the motherland, the survival of the Russian people, and the very soul of the nation. It was a war of extreme endurance. With each German assault, the defenders gritted their teeth and clung to what remained of the city, even as bodies fell in heaps and hope seemed to vanish. Winter approached, and with it the promise of even greater suffering. But retreat, never. This order transformed the Soviets into veritable ghosts of Stalingrad, relentless warriors who used desperation and discipline to transform every inch of the city into an invincible fortress. For them, losing Stalingrad was not an option. The very survival of the country was at stake. Not one step back became the battle cry of those who, surrounded by enemy fire and death, found in determination a flame that neither bullets nor cold nor hunger could extinguish. If you're passionate about epic battles and war heroes, sign up now and stay up to date with the stories that have shaped humanity. The Army of Ghosts, the invisible Soviet defense. In the deafening chaos of Stalingrad's ruined streets, Soviet soldiers became almost invisible, like silent shadows moving among the rubble. They were what the world would call a true army of ghosts. Warriors who knew every hole, every tunnel, every hidden corner of the destroyed city. As the Germans advanced, trying to crush resistance, the Soviets spread out deep within the city. Sewers, basements, destroyed factories, and even underground canals. There they hid, stalked, and attacked like relentless predators, reappearing when least expected to fire, throw grenades, or ambush their enemies. Among these ghosts, one name stood out: Vasily Zaitsev, a Soviet sniper. He became a living legend, with his precise aim and cool composure, eliminating German officers and soldiers from dozens of meters away. His presence spread fear and uncertainty among the invading troops, who never knew when or where the next deadly shot would come from. These invisible defenders turned Stalingrad into a nightmare for the Germans. Even amid fire, cold, and hunger, they never gave up. They knew that each enemy they fell was not only a military victory, but also a psychological one. The war wasn't just about territory, it was about the soul of the city, the survival of the homeland. The Germans, accustomed to quick and decisive victories, encountered a different kind of resistance, silent, persistent, and impossible to eliminate. This phantom army made each German advance more costly, slower, and bloodier. In that hellish landscape, invisibility was the Soviets' greatest weapon. They were shadows in the night, specters that wouldn't surrender, giving Stalingrad an almost supernatural strength. And so, step by step, they transformed the siege into a life-or-death struggle, where victory depended on whoever held out the longest in this white hell. Don't miss out on the greatest narrative of World War II. Subscribe and follow every decisive moment with us. The tractor factory and the mill, fortresses of hell. Amidst the devastation that engulfed Stalingrad, some buildings stood like true fortresses, key points where the battle became even more fierce and bloody. Among them, two stood out: the immense barricade tractor factory and the legendary Stalingrad mill. The tractor factory was more than just an industrial building. For the Soviets, it was a symbol of resistance, a nearly impregnable stronghold that became a labyrinth of death and despair. Its thick concrete walls withstood shelling and gunfire, while Soviet soldiers armed with rifles, machine guns, and even improvised weapons engaged in hand-to-hand combat against the German troops attempting to invade. The mill, a massive stone building, was strategically located and had become a vital control point for whoever held its ruins. Soldiers from both sides took turns controlling the site, which changed hands countless times during the bloodiest months of the battle. Every inch of the mill was fought over with almost animalistic fervor. Brutal fighting erupted within these structures. Explosions, screams, and nearby gunfire Grenades flew among the rubble, while combatants fell dead or wounded, forgotten in the cold and mud. The ground became slippery with blood. The smoke blinded, and the deafening noise drowned out even thoughts. These fortresses weren't just sites of combat. They were veritable symbols of the urban hell that Stalingrad had become. For the Soviets, holding out in these buildings meant keeping the flame of hope alive. For the Germans, taking them was the key to victory. And with each failed attempt, the frustration grew, as did the cost in human lives. In the crossfire, ordinary men became anonymous heroes, trapped in a nightmare where the line between life and death was as thin as the dust floating in the ruins. A war story told with blood, fire, and courage. Subscribe to see it all firsthand. General Chuikov takes command. Fight at 50 meters. Amidst the bloody chaos that gripped Stalingrad, one man emerged to unite and command the Soviet resistance with almost ruthless determination, General Vasily Chuikov. Upon assuming command of the defending troops, he knew that victory would depend on something far more brutal and close quarters than conventional grand strategies. Chuikov understood that there was no point in trying to fight German heavy artillery and tanks from a distance, as this would only leave his soldiers exposed and vulnerable. His tactic was bold and simple: force combat to less than 50 meters away, sticking his men to the enemy, turning the fight into a constant hand-to-hand conflict. This strategy came at a terrible cost, but it was effective. By keeping his soldiers so close to the Germans, he prevented the Nazi forces from using their heavy firepower accurately, as the risk of hitting their own men increased. It was a suffocating war, where every meter gained was marked by the blood of dozens of combatants. Chuikov demanded almost superhuman courage from his men, and they responded with desperate fury. There was no room for fear. Every soldier was a vital part of preventing the Sixth Army from taking the city. The streets became battlefields, where the sound of gunfire mingled with the sound of exploding grenades, shouts of command, and the brutal clash of bayonets. The general was not just a commander, but a symbol of resistance that refused to yield. He visited the trenches, encouraged his soldiers, and led by example, showing that in that bloody battle, determination could be more lethal than any weapon. This close-quarters tactic turned the battle into a danse macabre, where fear was replaced by relentless fury, and where every step taken meant a body fallen, a piece of ground gained in the most brutal war of World War II. In October 1942, despite the overwhelming force that seemed to accompany the Sixth Army since its initial advance, reality began to cruelly impose itself on the German troops. After weeks of fierce fighting and a partial conquest of the city, the advance began to stall. What had previously been a nearly relentless march became a slow, painful, and bloody struggle. The Germans held about 90% of Stalingrad, but this near victory hid a terrible price. The Soviet resistance, though bled, continued to drag itself like a tenacious shadow amidst the rubble, constantly regrouping to counterattack. The destroyed streets became death traps, where a sniper or an ambush could spring at any moment. To make matters worse, winter was approaching with its relentless fury. The biting cold was beginning to freeze not only the bodies but also the hopes of the German soldiers. The Sixth Army, exhausted after months of relentless fighting, was beginning to feel the effects of hunger, fatigue, and isolation. Supplies of ammunition, food, and fuel were becoming increasingly scarce. But even in the face of this suffering, the Soviets continued to arrive via the Volga River, as if the city itself were feeding them with an invisible force. New reinforcements, new weapons, new lives, ready to continue the hell that had already consumed so many. The German advance stalled, and what had seemed like a mortal blow to the Soviet Union began to transform into a cauldron where German defeat began to form. The winter, the terrain, and the relentless resistance of the defenders transformed Stalingrad into a place where war took on nightmarish proportions. a veritable white hell where the invaders' hopes began to freeze forever. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counterattack. On the night of November 19th, 1942, the frozen silence of Stalingrad was torn apart by an overwhelming roar. The Operation Uranus was underway, and with it, the fortunes of the war began to change dramatically. Soviet forces, after months of desperate resistance inside the city, launched a massive and meticulously planned counterattack, targeting not the city itself, but the fragile lines that held the German siege. While the Sixth Army remained trapped in the crossfire of urban battles, the Soviet armies attacked from the flanks, north and south of the German salient, with overwhelming force. With a swift and brutal move, the Soviets encircled Friedrich Paulus's army, trapping it within Stalingrad itself, turning the invaders into prisoners amidst the destruction they had wrought. The siege closed in with terrifying speed. The German troops, exhausted, hungry, and already worn out by the battle inside the city, saw their world become a prison with no escape. Hope of rescue or retreat evaporated like ice under the spring sun that had not yet arrived. It was the perfect trap, a game changer no one expected. Hunter becomes prey, and within that cauldron of fire, cold, and death, the Sixth Army was doomed to face the cruelest winter in its history, surrounded by enemies determined not to retreat. The siege, the trap of ice and blood. With Operation Uranus successful, the German Sixth Army was completely surrounded in the heart of Stalingrad, trapped in a death trap where the cold and hunger were as cruel as the Soviet gunfire. The Russian winter began to show its most terrifying face, with temperatures plummeting to 30-degree Celsius, freezing not only the ground, but also the trapped soldiers' hopes of survival. Within the siege, the environment became unbearable. The German soldiers, once proud and confident, now struggled against the ice invading their bodies, their fingers and feet frozen, suffering from disease, hunger, and exhaustion. Their clothing was insufficient to protect them from the deadly winter. The heat from the weapons and explosions contrasted with the biting cold that slowly consumed them. The Soviets pressed from the outside, launching constant attacks to prevent any attempt at escape or resupply. For the Germans, the world seemed reduced to a nightmare of ice and blood, where each day was a desperate struggle to avoid succumbing to the silent death of hunger and cold. The Sixth Army's morale plummeted along with the temperature, while hope of relief diminished with each passing day. Hitler, refusing to allow a retreat, ordered his men to resist at any cost, even if it meant mass death. Thus, surrounded, frozen, and starving, the German soldiers were trapped in a hellish cauldron, where the only way out was through surrender, something that until then seemed impossible for the arrogant Nazi war machine. Göring promises supplies. The fatal lie and the collapse of the Sixth Army. In late November 1942, Operation Uranus, a brilliant Soviet counteroffensive, closed its pincers around Stalingrad, trapping the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, and parts of the 4th Panzer Army. Some 300,000 Axis soldiers suddenly found themselves besieged, isolated in a vast, icy trap that would become known as the Kessel Cauldron. The dilemma: fight or break the siege. The situation inside the Kessel was desperate and deteriorating by the hour. Hunger was setting in, fuel was scarce, ammunition was running low, and the Russian winter, with temperatures plummeting to 30 degrees C, was beginning to take its toll. For the German High Command, two options presented themselves: the retreat, Operation Donnerschlag. The most logical military solution was to order the Sixth Army to attempt to break out of the encirclement immediately, while it still had some fighting strength and mobility. Generals at the front, like Paulus himself, knew this was the only real chance to save their men, hold the ground. Adolf Hitler, however, saw the issue from a purely ideological and strategic perspective. For him, Stalingrad, the city named after his archenemy, had become a symbol. Abandoning it would be an unacceptable humiliation and a major propaganda defeat. He ordered Paulus and his men to dig in and defend their positions to the last man and the last bullet, transforming the Sixth Army into a fortress on the Volga. Hitler needed assurance that this fortress could survive. It was at this critical juncture that Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe and one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich, decisively entered the scene. A promessa arrogante de Göring. At a high-level meeting, while the Heer generals insisted that holding the position without a land supply line was impossible, Göring intervened with an audacious and ultimately catastrophic promise. Pressured by Hitler and motivated by a mixture of arrogance, a desire to please the Führer, and a chronic overestimation of the Luftwaffe's capabilities, he guaranteed that his air force could supply the Sixth Army via a massive airlift. Göring promised to deliver at least 500 tons of supplies per day. This was the amount that the Sixth Army's experts calculated as the absolute minimum to keep the soldiers in fighting condition and survivable. Göring's promise sealed the Sixth Army's fate. With this guarantee, Hitler definitively rejected any plan for withdrawal and ordered Paulus to stand firm. The brutal reality of the air bridge Göring's promise quickly collided with a harsh reality, revealing itself to be not just an overestimation, but a fatal lie. Several factors made the mission impossible from the start. Aircraft shortage. The Luftwaffe simply lacked the necessary number of transport aircraft, such as the Junkers Ju-52, to meet its target. Many aircraft were undergoing maintenance, operating on other fronts, such as North Africa, or were not. Adapted to the extreme conditions of the Russian winter, bombers such as the Heinkel He-111 were improvised as transports, but their cargo capacity was inadequate. Unforgiving weather conditions, blizzards, dense fog, and extreme icing kept aircraft grounded for days on end. The runways, both the departure runways and the makeshift runways within the Kessel, became traps of frozen mud or deep snow, causing accidents and damaging planes. Soviet air defense, the Soviet Air Force and its anti-aircraft defenses established a formidable blockade around Stalingrad. The slow and vulnerable German transport planes became easy targets for Soviet fighters and strategically positioned artillery. The losses were staggering. Hundreds of aircraft and their experienced crews were lost. Logistics and distance. The nearest German airfields were hundreds of kilometers away, at the limit of aircraft's range. Each flight was a dangerous and time-consuming journey, consuming precious fuel. In practice, the airlift was a resounding failure. On its best days, the Luftwaffe managed to deliver little more than 100 tons of supplies. On most days, the volume was much smaller, and on some, nothing arrived at all. What was delivered often didn't meet needs. Instead of food, medicine, and ammunition, boxes of decorations, propaganda, or useless supplies arrived. The impact on soldiers and the fall in morale. For the starving and freezing soldiers in the Kessel, the sight of the few planes that managed to break through the siege was both a ray of hope and a source of deep despair. They watched helplessly as food supplies dwindled. Daily rations were reduced to a slice of sawdust bread and a thin soup. Horses were slaughtered for food, and reports of cannibalism began to surface. Göring's empty promise became a bitter joke among the troops. They felt betrayed and abandoned by the high command in Berlin. Faith in the Führer and the Reich's leadership, once unshakable, began to crumble. The Luftwaffe, once the symbol of German might, was now seen as proof of its leaders' incompetence and disconnection. Göring's reputation, already tarnished by previous failures such as the Battle of Britain, was destroyed forever. From the failure of the airlift, the fall of the Sixth Army became a slow and agonizing countdown. Without food, ammunition, and hope of rescue, German resistance was crushed by cold, hunger, and incessant Soviet attacks. Göring's promise was not just a miscalculation. It was the lie that condemned hundreds of thousands of men to a horrible death in the white hell that Stalingrad had become. The decision to trust Goering's airlift was not just a strategic error, it was the catalyst for a series of events that irreversibly sealed the fate of the Sixth Army. Let's dissect the elements that transformed an arrogant promise into one of the greatest military catastrophes in history. 1. Internal conflict. In the German High Command, the voice of reason ignored Goering's promise did not go unchallenged. Within the High Command, there was a direct clash between the reality on the front and the fantasy of Hitler's inner circle. General Kurt Zeitzler, Chief of the Army General Staff, Zeitzler was the leading voice of reason. He fully understood the logistical situation and implored Hitler to authorize the withdrawal. He knew the Luftwaffe was not up to the task. To prove his point, and in a gesture of solidarity with the besieged troops, Zeitzler even reduced his own daily rations to those of the soldiers in the Kessel, losing weight drastically in just a few weeks. His insistence, however, was seen by Hitler as pessimism and disloyalty. General Wolfram von Richthofen, commander of Luftflotte 4, the air commander on the scene, Richthofen, was one of the most competent officers in the Luftwaffe. He sent urgent and desperate reports to the High Command, categorically stating that the airlift was utterly impossible. He detailed the lack of aircraft, the weather conditions, the Soviet strength, and the inadequacy of the airfields. He knew that his superior, Goering's promise, was a dangerous fantasy. His warnings were ignored because they contradicted what Hitler wanted to hear. Goering's motivation. Why did Goering make a promise that his own field commanders knew was impossible? Political prestige. The Luftwaffe had suffered a severe blow to its reputation after the Battle of Britain. A spectacular success at Stalingrad would restore the prestige of Goering and his air force in the eyes of Hitler and the German people. Rivalry with the army. Here, there was intense rivalry between the branches of the armed forces. By saving the Sixth Army, Goering was demonstrating the Luftwaffe's superiority over the army, whose generals were insisting on withdrawal. Ignorance and arrogance. Goering was increasingly out of touch with the operational realities of war. He relied on optimistic reports and grossly underestimated both Soviet resilience and the limitations of his own forces. He remembered the success of the airlift to the Demyansk pocket the previous winter, but ignored the crucial differences. Demyansk involved a much smaller number of troops and faced significantly weaker Soviet opposition. Hitler's final decision, influenced by Goering's promise, was a triumph of political loyalty and ideological fantasy over military competence and tactical reality. 2. Operation Winter Storm. The last hope shattered. As the airlift failed miserably, a last-ditch rescue attempt was organized on the ground. Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm, led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. The plan: Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant strategists, assembled a relief group, 4th Panzer Army, to attack the Soviet lines from the southwest and open a corridor to the besieged 6th Army. Paulus's dilemma: Manstein's force managed to get within 50 kilometers of the Kesselat. This critical point, Manstein sent a message to Paulus ordering him to initiate his own breakout operation, codenamed Donnerschlag, or Thunderclap, to rendezvous with the rescue forces. Hitler's fatal order. Paulus, hesitant and legalistic, asked Hitler for permission to attempt the breakout. Hitler's answer was a categorical no. He was still obsessed with not abandoning the fortress of Stalingrad. Furthermore, Paulus argued that he didn't have enough fuel for his tanks to cover the necessary 50 kilometers. The truth is that Goering's failed airlift had created this fuel shortage, trapping the 6th Army in its place. Hitler's refusal, based on the belief that the airlift could still work, doomed Operation Winter Storm to failure. Manstein's forces were pinned down and eventually forced to retreat to avoid their own encirclement. The last window of opportunity to save the 6th Army had closed. Hell in the Kessel. Human disintegration. The failure of the airlift accelerated the physical and moral disintegration of the soldiers. Life within the siege. became a Dantesque vision. Hunger and disease. The daily diet consisted of less than 200 grams of stale bread and watery soup. The men, weakened by malnutrition, succumbed en masse to diseases such as typhus, dysentery, and jaundice. Minor injuries became death sentences due to the lack of medical supplies. The last flight out, the few planes that managed to land were the only hope of salvation. They evacuated a small number of wounded on their return trip. Chaotic scenes unfolded on the makeshift airfields, with desperate soldiers trying to storm the aircraft, often being shot at by their own officers to maintain order. Being selected for evacuation was like winning the lottery of death. Collapse of discipline. The once proud and disciplined Wehrmacht began to disintegrate. The authority of officers eroded. Soldiers abandoned their posts in search of food, and individual survival took precedence over any military objective. Göring's broken promise destroyed trust in leadership, the fundamental pillar of any army. Surrender and the aftermath. By late January 1943, organized resistance ceased. Hitler had promoted Paulus to field marshal on the eve of the surrender, a clear message to him to commit suicide, since no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus chose life and surrendered to the Soviets on January 31st. Of the nearly 300,000 men encircled, about 91,000 were taken prisoner. Exhausted, hungry, and sick, most would die on forced marches and in brutal Soviet prisoner-of-war camps. Only about 5,000 to 6,000 of them would see Germany again, years after the war's end. Göring's promise was not just a lie, it was the pillar upon which Hitler built his fatal decision to sacrifice an entire army for the sake of prestige and ideology. It was this empty guarantee that allowed the Nazi leadership to ignore reality, silence the voices of reason, and condemn hundreds of thousands of their own men to a slow and agonizing death. Stalingrad became the symbol not only of the turning point in the war, but also of the moral and strategic bankruptcy of the Third Reich. As the Russian winter of 1942 deepened, enveloping Stalingrad in a shroud of ice and silence, what remained of the German Sixth Army sank into an abyss of despair that transcended the war itself. The battle was no longer fought solely with bullets and bayonets against the Red Army, but within each soldier, a desperate struggle against the relentless trinity of hunger, cold, and hopelessness. The siege, now hermetically sealed after the failure of Göring's promised airlift and the annihilation of the last hope of rescue, became an existential trap, a laboratory of human suffering in its purest and cruelest form. Hunger was the omnipresent shadow, an internal enemy that corroded bodies and minds with methodical efficiency. Food simply ceased to exist. Rations, already reduced to starvation levels, disappeared completely, giving way to a frantic search for any substance that could trick the stomach. The soldiers, once proud and disciplined members of the world's most feared war machine, regressed to a primitive state. The horses, companions in draft and transport, were the first to fall, slaughtered wherever they were. Their meat, a prized treasure, was devoured to the bone, and even these were boiled to make a thin broth. When there were no animals left, hunting turned to the unthinkable. Leather belts, boots, pistol holsters, and any scrap of organic matter were cut off and boiled for hours in water dirty with melted snow, hoping to extract a bitter gelatin that could barely be called food. It was in this setting of absolute deprivation that the final taboo of the human condition was broken. Cannibalism, a whispered horror that had become a hideous reality, emerged from the shadows of despair. It was not an act of savagery, but the last and most terrifying resort of the survival instinct. Under the cover of polar nights, men crazed with hunger crawled to the frozen bodies of their own comrades, piled like cordwood in the streets and craters to carve off chunks of human flesh. Camaraderie, the cornerstone of military life, was replaced by suspicion. A lingering glance at a weakened comrade could be misinterpreted. A soldier's death was no longer just a tragedy, but a macabre opportunity. The white hell of Stalingrad had consumed not just the bodies, but the very souls of its men. The cold was the silent executioner, a partner to hunger in its work. Of destruction, with temperatures plummeting to -30 or 40 degrees Celsius, the Russian winter was a weapon in itself. Without adequate clothing, heated shelter, or fuel, soldiers were easy prey. Many simply froze to death at their posts, dying silently without firing a shot. Frostbite was an epidemic, turning fingers, feet, and faces into black, necrotic masses. Field hospitals, if they could be called that, were antechambers of death, where helpless doctors without medication or anesthesia watched minor injuries turn into gangrenous death sentences. Even war equipment gave up. Gun oil froze, engines wouldn't start, and German technology was rendered harmless by the primordial force of nature. This physical disintegration was accompanied by a total psychological collapse. The sense of abandonment was absolute. The empty promises of the high command, broadcast over still functioning radios, sounded like cruel mockery. Many soldiers succumbed to a profound apathy, a condition that became known as barbed wire death. They simply stopped. They stopped eating, talking, or moving. They sat in the snow, staring blankly, and waited for the end to come. They were ghosts in tattered uniforms, skeletal specters haunting a ruined city, witnesses to their own slow death. The fight for survival was no longer against the enemy on the other side of the front line, but against their own biology, against the madness born of hunger, and against the crushing certainty that they had been sacrificed. For the Soviet soldiers observing this slow agony, the sight of the dehumanized enemy was a grim and terrifying confirmation of the justice of their resistance. For the Germans, each sunrise revealed just another day of silent martyrdom, another step on the journey to oblivion in the heart of the white hell that Stalingrad had become. The disintegration of humanity, the slow death in the white hell of Stalingrad. As the last roar of the Luftwaffe's engines faded into the horizon and Operation Winter Storm was crushed by Soviet resistance, the German Sixth Army was left to a fate more cruel than swift annihilation in combat. What followed in Kessel-Stalingrad was no longer a battle in the traditional sense. It was the slow, methodical disintegration of civilization, a descent into hell where the laws of nature superseded the laws of man. The enemy was no longer just the Red Army soldier across the ruined street, but an apocalyptic trinity of hunger, cold, and despair that consumed everything, transforming the city into a vast open-air mausoleum. Wikipedia.org+21. Hunger was the driving force behind this human catastrophe. It infiltrated every shelter, every thought, becoming the only reality. Official rations, already reduced to a cruel joke, disappeared. Discipline, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, evaporated in the face of the primal need to eat. Soldiers' diaries, such as that of Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann, record this transition from optimism to obsession. With a piece of bread, the hunt began. The horses, numbering tens of thousands, were the first to be slaughtered, their meat distributed in tiny portions or fought over amid the chaos. Once they were gone, the men turned to dogs, cats, rats, and crows, hunting anything that moved until the Kessel became silent, devoid of any animal life. YouTube.com+1. Then, hunger forced them to look to the inanimate. Leather, an organic material, became a source of hope. Belts, boots, and holsters were cut into strips and boiled for hours in pots of melted snow, producing a nauseating gelatin that offered little nutrition and often caused dysentery, hastening the end. It was in this abyss of deprivation that society's last taboo was violated. Cannibalism, an act that defined the limit of the human condition, became a dark and silent reality. It was not an act of ritualistic savagery, but the cold calculation of survival. Under the cover of the polar nights, skeletal men ventured out of their holes, not to fight, but to search for the newly dead, whose frozen bodies provided a source of meat. Knives were used to cut muscles from the thighs and buttocks of fallen comrades. Trust, the sacred bond between soldiers, was shattered. A wounded or weak man was no longer just a burden, but a potential resource. megacurioso.com.br+1. Meanwhile, the cold acted as a relentless executioner. The winter of 1942-1943 was one of the harshest on record, with temperatures plummeting to 30 degrees C or 40 degrees C, exacerbated by a biting wind that cut through inadequate summer uniforms. Death from hypothermia was common and silent. Soldiers at sentry posts were found frozen, still clutching their rifles. Frostbite destroyed limbs, turning feet and hands into black, insensible masses. In the makeshift field hospitals, which were in reality filthy, overcrowded basements, doctors without painkillers, saws, or even bandages could only watch as gangrene consumed their patients. Equipment also succumbed. Gun oil froze. Tank engines wouldn't start, and the mighty German war machine was paralyzed by the brute force of nature. YouTube.com. This physical annihilation was mirrored by a total psychological collapse. The feeling of abandonment was absolute. Radio broadcasts from Germany, speaking of heroism and sacrifice, were met with bitter laughter or apathetic silence. Many soldiers fell into a state of terminal combat fatigue, a condition that today would be diagnosed as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. They simply gave up. They sat in the snow, oblivious to the bombings, the lice infesting their bodies, and the hunger that devoured them, and awaited death. They were the living dead of Stalingrad, skeletal ghosts wrapped in rags, their hollow, empty eyes haunting the ruins of a city that had become their tomb. For the Soviets, the sight of this disintegrated army was a terrifying testament to their own resilience. For the Germans, each day was a new circle of hell, a silent martyrdom, amid destruction, where the only certainty was that they had been forgotten by the world and condemned to perish in the frozen heart of Russia. neuroconhessimento.com.br+1. To give an even more personal dimension to this horror, I created the following file, a fictional diary based on real-life accounts from soldiers. Diary of an Unknown Soldier, 96th Infantry Division, December 28, 1942. Christmas passed like any other day, perhaps worse. The chaplain spoke of hope, but his eyes were as empty as ours. We ate the last part of the horse Fritz. It was frozen solid, and we had to break the bone with a rifle butt to get to the marrow. The cold isn't just cold anymore. It's a physical pain that settles into the bones. That night, I heard a man crying softly. In the morning, he didn't move anymore. No one had the strength to move him. He's just another pile of ice covered in snow. January 5th, 1943. Hunger. That's all I can think about. I tried to chew off a piece of my belt, but only managed to break a tooth. I traded my watch, a gift from my father, for 3 hard, moldy biscuits. I ate them so fast, I barely tasted them. I saw Klaus, from the 2nd Company, looking at the body of a recruit who died yesterday. His look wasn't one of sadness. It was calculation. I'm afraid to sleep. January 14th, 1943. There are no more animals. There is no more leather. Yesterday, a supply plane was shot down over us. It wasn't bread or ammunition that fell. It was crates of iron crosses. We laughed. We laughed until we cried. A hollow, terrible sound that echoed through the ruins. The decoration for our own funeral. The lieutenant shot himself this morning. No one blamed him. January 22nd, 1943, it happened. Gerard's group returned from a night patrol. They didn't bring prisoners or weapons. They brought a sack. The smell of meat cooking over a small fire of debris made me vomit the bitter bile that was all that was left in my stomach. No one talks about it. We just stare at the ground, avoiding each other's eyes. We're no longer soldiers. We're no longer men. We're just starving animals waiting our turn. January 31st, 1943. The radio says we've surrendered. I heard the field marshal surrendered. It makes no difference to us. The war ended long ago. The only question now is which death will come first, the Russian bullet or the end of this long, slow agony. I can't feel my legs anymore. I write this with the stumps of my fingers. If anyone finds this, tell my Elsa I loved her. Don't tell her how I died. The detailed expansion and diary I created seek to offer a complete and multifaceted view of the human collapse at Stalingrad, combining historical analysis with a personal and visceral perspective. 14. Twilight of the Gods. Paulus's surrender and the breaking of the oath. In the last days of January 1943, the Kessel Stalingrad had become a lunar landscape, a realm of frozen ruins and silence, punctuated only by the moan of the wind and the distant echo of artillery. The Sixth Army, once the crown jewel of the Wehrmacht, was dead in all but name. Its remnants, skeletal specters wrapped in rags, lay scattered in basements and craters, no longer a fighting force, but witnesses to a humanitarian catastrophe. At the epicenter of this collapse, in the damp, fetid basement of the Wehrmacht department store, General Friedrich Paulus was fighting the final battle, not against the Soviets, but against his duty, his conscience, and the ghost of his Führer. Paulus was the embodiment of the Prussian officer, a meticulous armchair strategist, brilliant on paper but hesitant in field command, and above all, shackled by an oath of unconditional loyalty to Adolf Hitler. For weeks, he had been the conduit through which the fantasy of Berlin clashed with the reality of Stalingrad. He read orders to hold the position to the last man as his men died of hunger and freezing, a contradiction that gnawed at his soul. His own generals, like Arthur Schmidt, his chief of staff, and a fanatical Nazi, pressured him to maintain resistance, while others, like General von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, openly pleaded for disobedience to save what remained of his troops. Paulus was paralyzed, a man caught between military logic, moral obligation, and blind obedience. The situation became untenable when the final Soviet offensive, Operation Ring, broke the Kessel divided into two pockets, north and south, making any centralized command a fiction. Communication was nearly impossible, and resistance had disintegrated into isolated acts of survival. It was then that Hitler, from his safe haven in the Wolf's Lair, made his most perverse move. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of his accession to power, a flurry of promotions was announced by radio to the officers in Stalingrad. The most significant was that of Paulus, elevated to the highest military rank, General Feldmarschall, Field Marshal. The promotion was not an honor. It was a death sentence wrapped in velvet. The message was clear and icy. In German military history, no field marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion was an implicit command to commit suicide. Hitler envisioned a Wagnerian ending, Field Marshal Paulus at his post, taking his own life, his sacrifice transformed by Goebbels into a myth of martyrdom to inspire the nation. One of his officers reportedly said to Paulus, "Congratulations, Herr Field Marshal. The promotion letter is an invitation to commit suicide." Another reportedly added, cynically, "But he didn't send us the pistol." Confronted with this macabre order, something inside the loyalist Paulus finally snapped. A devout Catholic, he viewed suicide as a mortal sin. More importantly, he looked at the emaciated faces of his staff and thought of the thousands still breathing in the city's basements. A heroic suicide would save no one. It would be the final act of subservience to a leader who had condemned them. In a rare moment of defiance recorded by witnesses, Paulus is said to have muttered dismissively, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this bohemian corporal," a shocking reference to Hitler's humble origins. He chose life, not just his own, but that of his men. He sent a final, unauthorized message. The Sixth Army, faithful to its oath and aware of the importance of its mission, has resisted to the last man and the last bullet to defend Germany. We ask you to take care of our families. It was a farewell, not a request for permission. On the Chi. Morning of January 31st, 1943, reality set in. A young Soviet lieutenant, Fyodor Yelchenko, leading a small group of soldiers, located the German headquarters. After a brief and tense negotiation, the Soviet officers were taken to the basement. There, they found the newly appointed field marshal, not in his impeccable uniform, but ill, his face drawn with dysentery, lying on a camp bed. The surrender was anticlimactic, almost bureaucratic. Paulus and his staff, including the fanatical Schmidt, formally surrendered. The image of the first German field marshal in history to be captured alive by the enemy was a devastating blow to the prestige of the Third Reich. The news hit the wolf's lair with the force of an earthquake. Hitler flew into one of his most legendary rages. He screamed, red-faced, about Paulus's ingratitude and cowardice. What hurts me personally is that I still promoted him to field marshal. I wanted to give him this final satisfaction. A man like this tarnishes the heroism of so many others at the last minute. He could have freed himself from all the pain and ascended to eternity and national immortality, but he chose to go to Moscow. For Hitler, surrender was a character flaw, a personal betrayal that destroyed his narrative of Nibelung sacrifice. Immediately, Goebbels' propaganda machine went into overdrive. The surrender was suppressed. Instead, German radio announcers, in somber voices and to the sound of the slow movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, announced that the Sixth Army had been annihilated, that its soldiers had fought to their last breath. The nation was plunged into 3 days of official mourning, not for the loss, but for the celebration of a fictitious martyrdom. Stalingrad became the symbol not of defeat, but of supreme sacrifice, a myth used to justify the proclamation of total war. While Germany staged its theater of heroism, the true survivors, some 91,000 men, began their own ordeal. Spectres in uniform, staggering through the snow, were rounded up and marched to the prison camps. For them, surrender was not the end of their suffering, but the transition to a new form of hell. Most would die of typhus, malnutrition, and exhaustion in the Soviet gulags. Paulus's surrender did not save them, but it gave them a chance, however slim. It was an act that, though viewed as treason by their Führer, represented the last glimmer of humanity from a commander who finally chose his men over his oath to a regime that had abandoned them to die. The legacy of Stalingrad, the axis of the world, shatters in the snow. The Battle of Stalingrad did not end with Paulus's surrender. It merely transformed. The sound of cannons was replaced by a lasting echo that would reverberate through history, a seismic fracture point that not only altered the course of World War II, but redefined the global balance of power for decades to come. With an estimated human cost of around 2 million dead, wounded, missing, or captured on both sides, Stalingrad was not only the bloodiest battle of the war, it was an abyss that consumed entire armies and forged a new future on a mountain of ruins and corpses. Strategic collapse and the broken myth. The most immediate legacy of Stalingrad was the strategic and psychological destruction of the German war machine on the Eastern Front. The loss of the Sixth Army and significant parts of the Fourth Panzer Army was not just a numerical defeat, it was the annihilation of one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced, well-equipped and ideologically motivated forces. Hundreds of thousands of irreplaceable veteran soldiers were wiped off the map. Equally important, a colossal amount of war materiel, tanks, artillery, aircraft and equipment was lost forever, a blow from which the already overstretched German war industry would never fully recover. Even more devastating was the collapse of the myth of German invincibility. Since 1939, the Wehrmacht had seemed like a force of nature unstoppable in its blitzkrieg. Stalingrad proved that the giant could bleed and die. For German soldiers on all fronts, the news, even censored and distorted by propaganda, was a profound blow to morale. Blind faith in Hitler's strategic genius was shaken, and the seed of doubt about ultimate victory began to germinate. From that moment on, Germany was forced into a reactive posture in the east, ceding the strategic initiative to the Red Army, which now began its slow, methodical, and relentless 2,000-kilometer march toward Berlin, the symbol of resistance and Soviet revival. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became the cornerstone of its national identity in the 20th century. The city, named after the Soviet leader, was transformed into a sacred symbol of sacrifice and resilience. Although reduced to a field of rubble, a city reportedly containing more metal from bombs and bullets than original building materials, it was never truly conquered. The city's defense, personified by the motto, "There is no land for us beyond the Volga," became the stuff of legend, an epic of human determination against all odds. The victory galvanized the Soviet Union. The morale of the Red Army and the Soviet people, sorely tested by 18 months of retreats and humiliating defeats, soared. The battle proved that the Soviet soldier, when well led and motivated, could not only stop but destroy the enemy's best troops. Stalin, whose reputation had been tarnished by the initial disaster of Operation Barbarossa, emerged as the architect of victory, consolidating his power and projecting the image of the USSR as the leading force in the fight against fascism. This newfound prestige would give the Soviet Union immense influence at the negotiating table with the Western Allies and pave the way for its rise as one of the two post-war superpowers. The global turnaround and the price of victory globally, Stalingrad was the definitive turning point. Before the battle, the world still held its breath, uncertain whether the Soviet Union would survive. After the victory, the question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but when and at what cost. The battle drained Germany's elite reserves, preventing Hitler from transferring experienced troops to combat the Allied landings in North Africa, and later in Italy and Normandy. It can be argued that the success of D-Day in 1944 was built on the bones of the soldiers who fought and died on the banks of the Volga, who kept the bulk of the Wehrmacht locked in a deadly struggle in the east. The white hell of Stalingrad revealed the terrible price of total war. The scale of death and destruction was so vast it defies comprehension, a grim testament to the human capacity for industrialized violence. Yet amid this horror, the battle also proved that courage and the will to fight, even in the most inhumane conditions of hunger, cold, and terror, could alter the course of history. Thus, Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was the moment when the tide of war turned irreversibly. It was the point at which the world understood that victory over Nazi tyranny was possible, but that this victory would require a sacrifice of blood, sweat, and tears on a scale never before seen, a price that was paid, for the most part, on the frozen steppes and in the destroyed streets of the city that refused to die. The Battle of Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was the starkest portrayal of war at its most brutal and relentless. It was the stage where ordinary men were forced to fight in a landscape of fire, ruins, and ice, facing the enemy and death itself at every turn. What happened there was not just the fall of an army, but the resilience of hope in the face of despair, courage defying the impossible. Stalingrad showed the world that even amidst the bloodiest chaos, human will can rise like an insurmountable wall. This battle, marked by heroism, sacrifice, and unspeakable suffering, forever changed the course of World War II. It taught that strength lies not only in weapons, but in the indomitable spirit of those who refuse to surrender. And so, in the midst of that white hell, the light was born that would announce the beginning of the end of Nazism, proving that, even in the deepest darkness, victory can emerge, at the highest price, but never impossible.